welcome. This is the Gonzaga Socratic Club. We've existed on the Gonzaga campus for a little over 15 years. The mandate of the Socratic Club is inspired by the Oxford Socratic Club of the mid-1900s in Oxford. You probably could have guessed that. It was an organization that was put together to address well, there are a lot of, I want to back up and say, just think, 100 years or so ago, or even 50 or 60 years ago, there wasn't quite as much to distract people. The entertainment prospects were much more limited. So in Oxford in the post-war years, there were all kinds of organizations for everything you can imagine. But students actually said, well, we're really interested in a place where people could get together and talk in an academic way about religious issues and challenges to religion. And so the Oxford Socratic Club was started, and the first president they asked or invited to preside over the club was C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian author and apologist and author of the Chronicles of Narnia, but also works in Christian apologetics. So the Gonzaga Socratic Club takes the Oxford Club as our inspiration. The Socratic part is follow the argument wherever it leads, so we're interested in intellectual or academic treatment of subjects, ranging all across a pretty wide span of things from the problem of evil to Christology. We had a presentation earlier this semester to Christianity and popular culture and so forth. And we're pleased today, this is the fourth and last meeting of this semester. We're pleased today to have a presentation on philosophical anthropology, broadly speaking, but our speaker's particularly interested in addressing the assumptions that guide contemporary neurophysiological research. The title of the presentation today is Informing Neuroscience, How the Hylomorphic Soul Underpins Neural Mechanisms of Consciousness. Our speaker is Matthew Owen, who received his PhD from the University of Birmingham. He's the Elizabeth R. Cook Research Fellow for Tiny Blue Dot Consciousness Studies at Gonzaga University. That's a big mouthful, but technically he's here as a visiting scholar under the aegis of the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute. And for that reason, he's around, and I thought it'd be great to have him come and speak to the Socratic Club. So if you would, please welcome Matthew Owen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Calhoun, for the introduction and for organizing this event. Do you guys need me to speak into this microphone? Yeah? Well, just let me know if you have trouble hearing me.
Can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Yep, better? All right.
Put it back on the stand.
Okay.
Whatever.
Let's see if that works. Can you hear me all right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I also want to thank Gonzaga University for hosting me during my Tiny Blue Dot Fellowship, and especially Brian Clayton, who has served as my co-advisor along with my lead advisor, Christof Koch. As someone who grew up here in Eastern Washington, it has been a tremendous honor to be a ZAG and to represent Gonzaga University. My fellowship research has focused on the metaphysical possibility of empirically discerning and quantifying irreducible consciousness in unresponsive patients. But tonight, my topic is focused specifically on what contemporary neurobiology entails about the nature of the mind and human ontology. Since I am not a rhetorician, nor an entertainer, nor much of a charismatic public speaker in any sense, hence the fact that I was having trouble with the microphone, but rather a philosopher, I think it might be helpful to start by boring you with clarifying some key terms in the philosophy of mind. The easiest of these terms to understand is materialism, as long as you don't think too hard about what matter is. For the sake of making decent headway, let us assume that we all know what matter is and define materialism as the view that says all that exists is material. Materialism is also often used in reference to a view of human nature that says human persons are purely material entities. According to materialism, Madonna nails it with her description of our world and herself in the chorus, "We are living in a material world, and I am a material girl." A close cousin of materialism is physicalism. Once again, as long as you don't think too hard about what it means for something to be physical, physicalism is easy to understand. It is basically materialism applied specifically to the nature of the mind. In a nutshell, it's the idea that the mind is physical. Consciousness, thought, emotions, intentions are all purely physical, according to physicalism. Now, in contrast to materialism and physicalism, there is dualism. In philosophy of mind, there are two main forms of dualism that concern us here. There's property dualism, and then there's substance dualism. According to property dualism, mental states or properties, such as my mental intention to think about a mathematical equation, is a non-physical mental property. Like property dualism, substance dualism is committed to the idea that there are non-physical mental properties, but also that these properties are the properties of a substance that is non-physical, or not merely physical. So according to property dualism, there are non-physical mental properties, and substance dualism goes a step further and says the bearer of these non-physical mental properties is a substance that's not reducible to something physical. As a side note, it will be helpful to point out that in theological circles, dualism often refers to a view that the whole cosmos, or about the whole cosmos, that says matter is evil and the spiritual is good. This is not at all what I, or any professional philosopher of mind that I know of, nor any neuroscientist interested in human nature and consciousness, means by dualism. When we use the term, we are referring to human nature and the mind. And according to the form of dualism I will present in due course, the body is not only good, but also essential to human nature. As one surveys the history of philosophy, it is easy to get the impression that both materialism and dualism, in their various forms, have been viable contenders. From antiquity to the Enlightenment, versions of dualism were considered rational options. And of course, it is not only in philosophy, but also religion, that dualism has been taken quite seriously. Since I am a Christian and therefore most familiar with the Christian religion, I will give a couple examples from Christianity. One could give authoritative examples from the history of Christian thought, citing Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, Calvin, the Chalcedonian Creed, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the like. Or one might refer to 2,000 years of Christian teaching that has taught that there is an intermediate state between bodily death and general resurrection, during which the souls of the deceased continue to exist in a disembodied state, awaiting physical bodily resurrection. But since time is limited and I wish to focus today on the relevant neuroscience and philosophy, let me focus on two examples from Christ and the Apostle Paul. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 28, Christ exhorts his hearers as follows: "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Never mind the fact that sweet baby Jesus grew up to say such unpleasantries about hell. From the standpoint of human ontology, his warning seems to presuppose a non-materialist, even dualist view of human nature. And after coming to fear God himself and accordingly receiving God's grace offered in Christ, the hope the Apostle Paul expressed to the church at Philippi also seems inconsistent with materialism and to presuppose that he continues to exist after the death of his body and before it will be raised in the general resurrection. For in Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 to 26, he considers two possibilities. One, that he should remain on sometime longer in the flesh before he dies bodily. And two, that he should die bodily and leave the flesh, but be present with Christ. For me, writes the apostle, to live, that is option one, is Christ, because he will continue doing Christ's work in his earthly ministry. And to die, that is option two, is gain, because the result of bodily death would be that he leaves the flesh, but goes to be with Christ. And he admits, my desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. The Apostle Paul's desire is anchored in his expectation that is informed by his Christian theology, according to which he will continue to exist after the death of his body, which suggests a non-materialist, dualist human ontology. Despite the fact that dualism has been a viable option throughout the history of philosophy and arguably the option in the Christian religion, modern Western philosophy has been dominated by various versions of materialism and physicalism. In the early 90s, John Searle made the following assessment regarding contemporary philosophy of mind. Mainstream orthodoxy consists of various versions of materialism, wrote Searle. Today, the non-physical mind of dualism is commonly considered a relic of our pre-neuroscientific past. In The Astonishing Hypothesis, The Scientific Search for the Soul, molecular biologist and neuroscientist Francis Crick proposes that human persons are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And it is not only secularists who are inclined to agree. Well-known Fuller Seminary professor Nancy Murphy claims that neuroscience provides dramatic evidence for physicalism. Even theologian Michael Horton informs the faithful in The Christian Faith, a Systematic Theology for Pilgrims on the Way, that philosophical defenses of materialism seem increasingly substantiated by science. Over recent decades of advanced research in neurobiology and related fields, the fact that the mind is matter, that is, the brain, has become firmly established. Granted, not everyone shares such sentiments. And Horton's claim about philosophical defenses of materialism strikes me as quite ironic when I read statements like the following from a philosopher as prominent as Lawrence Bonjour. As far as I can see, writes Bonjour, materialism is a view that has no very compelling argument in its favor and that is confronted with very powerful objections to which nothing even approaching an adequate response has been offered. Nevertheless, most would still agree with the concession found in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The neuroscientific milieu of the past 4 decades has made it harder for philosophers to adopt dualism, writes Bickel in his entry on philosophy of neuroscience in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. True as that may be, we must ask, what is the evidence modern neuroscience provides for physicalism and against dualism? What recent research in neurobiology is it that substantiates physicalism and undermines dualism? Surely it is not merely the fact that acts of the mind, such as thought, are associated with the brain, for this is hardly new information provided by modern neuroscience. The Greek physician Hippocrates knew this much, as did medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas. And it is not just the intellectually elite who have been privy to this information. Barroom brawlers did not start swinging for the head because they were enlightened by modern neuroscience. So what original evidence has modern neuroscience provided that disproves dualism? The foremost answer is neural correlates of consciousness, which are often referred to as NCC for brevity. Neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC, are the minimal neural mechanisms physically sufficient for consciousness. Although factually inaccurate, but conceptually easy to understand, the most common example of an NCC is C-fiber activation in the nervous system that takes place when a subject is in a conscious state of pain. The C-fiber activation is the neural correlate of the conscious state of pain, according to this example. Another example, one that's likely the NCC of seeing a face, is neural activity in the fusiform face area in the visual system, or the visual cortex. Figure 1 on the slide is a simple illustration of a content-specific NCC corresponding to a visual perception of a dog, which portrays the basic idea of what an NCC is. Research focused on neural correlates is relatively young, having begun about 3 decades ago. The contemporary search for NCC was predominantly co-instigated by the eminent biologist Francis Crick and his longtime collaborator and my fellowship advisor of neuroscience, Christof Koch, who is now the president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle, which is endeavoring to map the mouse brain and the human brain. In 1990, Crick and Koch published their seminal article, Toward a Neurobiological Approach to Consciousness. They were integral in igniting the science of consciousness, of which the search for NCC is arguably the centerpiece. This young area of research faces conceptual as well as methodological challenges, yet NCC research can be immensely advantageous from a medical standpoint. The precise localization and identification of neural correlates can increase our understanding of the neural mechanisms underpinning certain mental ailments, which can be a vital prerequisite to effective treatment. And if we can identify the NCC of being conscious versus unconscious, which is often called the full NCC, that could give us an empirically discernible indicator or footprint of when unresponsive patients are minimally conscious. While the medical implications of NCC are very important and fascinating, absolutely fascinating in their own right, what I will focus on here is the implications of NCC with respect to the nature of the mind and consciousness. On the basis of such correlations, it is often argued that physicalism is true and dualism is false. My aim is to offer a critical analysis of this line of reasoning. To do so, I will first introduce the neuroscientific methodology used to identify NCC, and then consider what NCC imply. Lastly, I will present the mind-body powers model of NCC, which provides a metaphysical explanation of neural correlates that's informed by Thomas Aquinas' view of human nature and Aristotle's understanding of causation. It should be noted that I will not concern myself here with the question of whether there are NCC. I assume that there are. My concern is what they imply and what best explains them. Fundamental to identifying neural correlates of consciousness is finding neural activity that consistently corresponds with certain conscious states. Imaging brain activity is central to this endeavor. Over a century ago, Italian physiologist Angelo Masso laid the conceptual foundation or the conceptual basis for brain imaging techniques vital to the contemporary search for NCC. A chief challenge to studying the brain is that it's enclosed in a hard protective casing, that is, the skull. Masso worked with a patient named Bertone who suffered extensive damage to the top of his skull, and as a result, much of it was missing. Where Bertone's skull was missing, Masso placed a cap made out of a rubber-like substance, gutta percha. This flexible cap made it possible to record brain pulsations of blood pressure correlated with mental activity such as emotional arousal and doing arithmetic. Marceau's study confirmed a straightforward hypothesis. That is, if the brain works harder, there will be increased blood flow to the brain. So if the brain works harder, when the mind works harder, there will be increased blood flow to the brain when the mind works harder. Put differently, increased mental activity correlates with increased blood flow in the brain. Marceau confirmed this by measuring the increased blood flow in Breton's brain that took place when Breton's mental activity increased. However, the method Marceau used to measure pulsations in Breton's brain had a limitation. It was effective only if the patient had an abnormal skull breach. Marceau's ingenious human circulation balance, pictured here, was invented to overcome this limitation. Marceau had his patients lay on a table that was essentially a balance intended to measure pulsations of blood flow that would tip the balance ever so slightly. Whether or not Marceau's human circulation balance was reliable, his work laid the conceptual foundation for non-invasive functional brain imaging techniques and technology. Non-invasive functional brain imaging is done while the brain is active and without being invasive to the brain by penetrating it in any significant way. Such brain imaging is vital to the search for NCC, since it allows us to discover brain activity that corresponds with a conscious subject's mental activity. Needless to say, non-invasive functional brain imaging technology has advanced significantly since Marceau's day. In the 1920s, a German psychiatrist, Hans Berger, discovered it's possible to record electrical activity in the brain from the human scalp. This type of recording is called an electroencephalogram, or EEG. Oops. Positron emission tomography, or PET, and functional magnetic resonance imaging have also since developed. A PET scan can reveal blood flow, glucose metabolism, oxygen metabolism, or concentrations of dopamine transporter indicative of brain activity. An fMRI reveals increased brain activity by revealing increased blood flow. The blood carries oxygen on molecules of hemoglobin carrying iron that changes the thermodynamic and magnetic properties of the brain area, which is detected by magnetic resonance imaging. This technology is invaluable in the contemporary search for NCC, since it allows us to identify the neural activity in the brain that correlates with our conscious mental activity. So by observing brain activity via fMRI, while subjects in a study report their conscious experience, we can identify the NCC of that experience, and the methodological no-report paradigm is now being used as well. This paradigm has arisen out of a concern that the standard method confuses the NCC of seeing a face, for example, with the NCC of a subject's conscious intention to report seeing the face, or they're thinking about the fact that, oh, I see a face and I need to report that. On the top row of Figure 1 in Koch, Massimini, Bali, and Tononi's article, you can see a comparison of the standard paradigm where reports are used to indicate the conscious state of the subject versus the no-report paradigm that includes trials in the study without subjective reports and relies on physiological indicators that were previously confirmed by reports from the subject. So on this top row up here, you can see the comparison of this image and this image principally. And you can see that there's a lot more activity represented in this image compared to this one. So the idea is that this image gets us closer to the true NCC of seeing a face. Because in this one you have also the activity that corresponds to reporting that you see a face, or perhaps thinking about the fact that you see a face. While the evidence for neural correlates of consciousness may be clear, it's not obvious what such correlations entail regarding the nature of the mind. At this point, a common fallacy of confusing causation with correlation is tempting to commit. This fallacy is committed when one infers that X caused Y simply because X is correlated with Y. If one inferred that Barack Obama winning the presidential election in 2008 caused the financial crisis of 2008 simply because there's a correlation between the two events, they would commit this fallacy. Correlation doesn't entail causation. One needs further rationale to infer that a correlation is best explained by or suggests a causal relation. Likewise, a correlation by itself doesn't entail dependency, identity, or that one correlate is reducible to the other. Given that X is correlated with Y, we need more information to justifiably conclude that X depends on Y, is identical to Y, or is reducible to Y. Suppose that all around the world, whenever any philosopher heard a knock on their door, they found a packaged philosophy book on their doorstep. On the basis of this correlation alone, we couldn't justifiably infer that the packaged books caused the knocks, lest we commit the fallacy of confusing correlation and causation. But likewise, we couldn't infer that the door knocks depend on the philosophy books, nor could we infer that the knocks are identical to the books, or in some way reducible to them. Further information would be required to justifiably make such inferences. Now, in some cases where we've identified an NCC, we might have additional data that justifies further inferences. For example, suppose that whenever Fern was in a mental state of remembering her childhood in Kansas, a particular part of her brain lit up. And suppose further that the same area lights up in Catherine's brain whenever she remembers her childhood in Washington State. Moreover, presume that the data related to Fern and Catherine confirms numerous studies with many human subjects. Given this, we could know that Fern and Catherine's mental states of remembering their childhood correlate with neural activity in a particular part of the human brain. From this correlation alone, we couldn't infer that Fern and Catherine's mental state caused the neural activity, depended on it, was identical to it, or reducible to it. However, suppose that Fern and Catherine lost the part of their brain with the neural correlates, and directly after this, they could never again remember their childhoods. Given this, the data set would then include more than just the correlations. With this additional data, it would be justifiable to conclude that their mental state of remembering their childhood was not only correlated with the neural activity, but also depended on it. If a physicalist assumed physics is fundamental before mapping the correlation between Fern and Catherine's mental activity and the corresponding neural activity, she would likely conclude that the correlation implies that the mental activity depends on the neural activity before gaining the additional data. And she would be justified in doing so to the degree that her assumption was well justified. But she would not be arriving at this conclusion merely on the basis of the correlation or merely on the basis of the empirical data. Rather, she would be justifiably arriving at the conclusion on the basis of the correlation coupled with her pre-experimental assumptions. Given that we all have pre-experimental assumptions that inform how we interpret empirical data, it's important to not only acknowledge such assumptions, but also analyze them and the epistemic role they play. And according to David Chalmers, once we recognize the central role of pre-experimental assumptions in the search for NCC, we realize that there are limitations on just what we can expect this search to tell us. Given this, it's fitting that Thomas Metzinger writes in his influential volume, Neural Correlates of Consciousness. However, mapping does not mean reduction. Correlation does not mean explanation. Once strict, fine-grained correlations between brain states and conscious states have been established, a number of theoretical options are still open. Assume that we find a strict and systematic correlation between a certain brain property or type of neural event N and the subjectively experienced phenomenal property of sogginess S. This is entirely compatible with Cartesian dualism. The underlying relation could indeed be a causal one, namely causal interaction between events in two ontologically distinct domains. If the ideas of Descartes or those of Popper and Eccles, well-known dualists, were correct, then we would certainly find neural correlates of consciousness. Metzinger's words are echoed by Christof Koch, as he pointed out to me in 2016. Note that the NCC themselves are neutral from the point of view of physicalism/materialism, or one of the various shades of dualism. Under any reading, consciousness will have physical correlates. The question is, what are those correlates? Where are they? And what can and will they tell us about how consciousness is generated in the first place? They also don't speak to whether or not consciousness can be analyzed using reductionism or other mereological assumptions. And in his most recent book, published in September of 2019, Koch provides similar clarification. Francis Crick and I meant the NCC language to be ontologically neutral, which is why we spoke of correlates with regard to the age-old battles of the isms, dualism versus physicalism, and their many variants, as we felt that at this point in time, science could not take a firm position with respect to resolving the mind-body problem. No matter what you believe about the mind, there is no doubt that it is intimately related to the brain. The NCC is about where and how this intimacy takes place. And in an endnote, just prior to this paragraph, Christof points out that I interpret the NCC within a framework informed by Thomas Aquinas' human ontology. And in due course, I'll provide my model of NCC that he refers to. At this point, the main takeaway is that both Metzinger and Koch, who are leading researchers in this area, and Koch is arguably the leading researcher, point out that both physicalist and dualist ontologies are consistent with NCC. And interestingly, dualist critic Jaegwon Kim, who unfortunately just passed away last week, has gone even a step further. In Physicalism or Something Near Enough, Kim acknowledges that some dualist views even entail NCC, which is what J.P. Moreland has argued is the case with respect to his Thomistic-like version of substance dualism. The data revealing that there are NCC is well established and will become more so as the contemporary search for neural correlates continues. This is interesting data, and it can be quite medically advantageous. But the fact that NCC exists is insufficient to establish that dualism is false and physicalism is true. As a result, philosophical argumentation is needed to arrive at such a conclusion. Inspired by J.J.C. Smart's work that he published in 1959, his article, Sensations in Brain Processes, some have argued for the identity theory, which is a version of physicalism, by appealing to the principle of simplicity, or Occam's razor. According to this line of reasoning, the simplest and therefore best explanation of neural correlates of consciousness is that conscious states are identical to their neural correlates. That is, they are nothing over and above the neural processes. We can call this the simplicity argument for the identity theory. While the identity theory might have simplicity in its favor, there are several issues that raise trouble for it and present significant weaknesses with the simplicity argument offered in its support. One weakness of the simplicity argument is that it rests upon one and only one theoretical virtue. Simplicity is significant, but it is not the only theoretical virtue. To use Mario Bunge's terminology, from the weight of simplicity in the construction and assaying of scientific theories, simplicity competes with additional desiderata. There are additional theoretical virtues to consider, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, fertility, accuracy, internal coherence, and consistency with widely accepted theories and background knowledge. If the identity theory is the simplest theory, that is a significant point in its favor. However, by itself, simplicity is not conclusive. If simplicity itself were conclusive, then we should go with a view like solipsism and conclude that there is just one mind that exists that is imagining in CC data along with everything else. It is hard to think of a simpler theory. But given that there is more to consider than simplicity, we need not commit ourselves to solipsism, simply because it's simple. Likewise, an appeal to simplicity is not itself sufficient to establish that dualism is false and physicalism is true. More importantly, there are good reasons to think that physicalism's simplicity is, in fact, poverty, as Koch has recently put it in Consciousness Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. While physicalism's purported simplicity might make it attractive, we must weigh a view against how well it coheres with all the data and how well it explains all the data that we have about ourselves. And in addition to empirical data, we also have what Roderick Chisholm called philosophical data about ourselves in his book, Person and Object, a metaphysical study. Our own consciousness is data that fits into the category of philosophical data about ourselves. Qualia is probably the most well-known facet of consciousness that has raised serious trouble for physicalism in recent times and prompted reconsiderations of dualist alternatives. Qualia are the felt sensations of what it's like to be in a particular conscious state, such as the felt sensation of what it's like to taste cherry Coke, or to be in a state of flow as you ski down a steep pitch on a powder day, or the felt sensation of what it's like to feel the dentist drill into your tooth during a root canal treatment. The difference of qualia is precisely why we prefer particular experiences over and above other experiences. I would much rather have the felt sensation of what it's like to ski down a steep slope on a powder day as opposed to having a root canal treatment, right? There are various problems for physicalism related to qualia. For one, as Hilary Putnam famously pointed out, it seems that beings that do not have the same neuronal constitution as humans could nevertheless have the same conscious experience as a human. For example, C-fiber activation in the human nervous system might correspond to a human feeling pain, but it seems possible that an alien, for example, who lacks C-fibers could have the same conscious experience of feeling pain that corresponds to different physical processes. And David Chalmers has famously argued that zombies are possible, which would not be the case if physicalism were true. A zombie is essentially a physical duplicate of a human person that lacks conscious experience. The possibility of zombies suggests that you can have all the requisite physical states without having consciousness, which indicates that consciousness itself is distinct from the physical substrate of consciousness. And there are also epistemological objections to physicalism that appeal to the epistemic access a person has to their conscious experience. In my opinion, Lawrence Bonjour has presented the clearest and best version of this type of argument in his article, What is it like to be a human rather than a bat?, published in the American Philosophical Quarterly in 2013. Such arguments have provided considerable motivation for adopting dualism and for an accessible treatment of these types of arguments. I would recommend David Chalmers' book, The Conscious Mind, In Search of a Fundamental Theory. But essentially what these thought experiments that philosophers generate using the idea of zombies or the idea of aliens that feel pain is what we're essentially trying to show is that it's possible, it seems, to have the neural correlate but not have the conscious state. And therefore, the conscious state can't be identical to the neural correlate. Or it's possible to have the conscious state, in the case of the alien, but not have the neural correlate, have some different type of neural constitution. And so that, too, would show that the two are not identical. The neural correlate and the conscious state are not identical, because you could have the conscious state without the neural correlate, or the neural correlate without the conscious state. And then the epistemic access arguments basically go like this. I have first-person private access to my own conscious states. Like I can, if I chose to think about Santa Claus right now as I'm standing up here in front of the room, you probably wouldn't know it unless I expressed it to you, right? But I would know it. I would know my conscious state of thinking about Santa Claus. And it doesn't matter how much you knew about my brain and what was taking place in my brain, you wouldn't be able to know that unless I somehow communicated to you that is what I'm thinking about. So I have first-person, private, direct access to my own conscious states, but I don't have such access to the neural processes that are taking place in my brain. And the neuroscientist also doesn't have that sort of access to my conscious experience. So there's a difference of epistemic access. Yet there are also, in addition to these arguments that motivate property dualism, there are powerful arguments that go a step further and also provide good reasons to adopt substance dualism. Dean Zimmerman has argued from irreducible experiences or property dualism to an irreducible experiencer or substance dualism via his vagueness argument. The basic idea of this argument is that all the material candidates for being the bearer of experiences, such as a body or a brain, are too vague. William Hasker has argued for a version of emergent substance dualism based on the unity of consciousness, which is the fact that all my distinct conscious states at a time, such as seeing different colors and shapes while hearing different sounds and feeling different sensations, are unified as one whole overall conscious experience. Richard Swinburne has provided powerful rationale for substance dualism based on various philosophical data about ourselves, such as personal identity and free will. And one can find a catalog of arguments for substance dualism in the recently released Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. So the upshot of the various arguments for property dualism and substance dualism, at least for our present purposes, is that physicalism appears to be explanatorily inadequate once we consider more facts about ourselves beyond the fact that there are mental states that correlate with neural processes. Given this, such correlates do not appear to undermine dualism as a viable contender in the philosophy of mind and metaphysics of human ontology. However, in the time remaining, I want to go a step further and present a model that gives an explanation of NCC that is informed by a substance dualist view of human nature. The mind-body powers model of NCC provides a metaphysical explanation of neural correlates of consciousness. I have explicated the model in depth in this particular article. Here, I will give a brief introduction to its ideological basis, and then a basic overview of the model itself. The metaphysics of Aristotelian causation and a view of human ontology derived from Thomas Aquinas' thought on human nature, which I call neo-Thomistic hylomorphism, provide the ideological foundation for the mind-body powers model. According to Aristotle, Entities have capacities or powers, which are the source of change. On this view, powers are not mere projections of ours about reality. Rather, powers are objective features of the world that cannot be reduced to non-powers. There are both active powers, which are capacities to bring about change, and passive powers, which are capacities to undergo change. Aristotle defines an active power as one that exercises its powerfulness on a corresponding passive one, to quote Anaxagoras there. And a passive power depends for its manifestation on an active power. A pool of water has the passive power to be heated by the noonday sun, which has the active power to heat the pool. Yet both the active power and the passive power must be manifested in order for either one to be manifested. Hence, Aristotelian powers depend for their activation on the activation of their mutual partner powers, as Marmordora words it. Thus, according to an Aristotelian powers ontology, there are interdependent partner powers that are naturally co-manifested. Once again, as Anna Marmordora puts it, because of their mutual dependence for activation, partner powers realize their natures in activities that are co-determined, co-varying, and co-extensive in time. According to neo-Thomistic hylomorphism, the view of human ontology that informs the model, a human person is a single material substance naturally consisting of a substantial form that informs matter. A material substance consists of matter that is unified by a substantial form that also grounds its essence, according to this view of hylomorphism. In short, the form grounds the existence of the material substance that it informs, and all its parts. Following Aristotle, Aquinas thought of the human soul as the substantial form that informs matter constituting the body. As the form of the body, the soul grounds the body's existence as it grounds its unity and essence. The soul is united to the body as its form. Therefore, contra Platonism, no accidental or contingent relation, such as mover to moved, is needed to unite soul and body. And for this reason, it can also overcome the causal pairing problem, but that's another talk. On neo-Thomistic hylomorphism, the soul has physical properties in a derivative sense, given that it is the form of a physical body. With that said, the most controversial element of the view is that the soul is a substance that is not reducible to the body it informs. In this way, the soul is a non-physical substance, even though it has physical properties that are, strictly speaking, the properties of the body it informs. Though non-physical, the soul is causally potent. It is no powerless, abstract object tantamount to a free-floating shape. Rather, it is a powerful entity, and due to human nature, it depends on the body to manifest its powers. Like God and angels, the nature of human persons is rational, but it is also sensory, like animals, according to Aquinas. Given this, and that he followed Aristotle's thought that the body is required for the soul to sense, Aquinas considered the body necessary for human persons to operate consistently with their nature, and therefore essential to human nature. Even human thought requires the body for its natural operation. Hence, Aquinas writes, "But a body seems necessary for the intellective soul above all for its proper operation, which is to understand." Aquinas thought the human body has the variety of organs it has so that the soul can manifest its various powers or capacities. As a result, the different capacities do not exist on account of the different organs. Instead, nature has established this difference in organs so as to match with the difference in capacities, wrote Aquinas. Different capacities rely on different organs that have different structures sufficient to manifest different powers. And as this is true of all organs, it is equally true of the brain. Aquinas thought about the soul's dependence on the body to exercise its powers in light of the scientific understanding of his time. Hence, he thought about these issues at the level of organs, not the cellular level, which was unobservable during his day, which predated the first use of the term neuron and Santiago Ramon y Cajal's neuron doctrine by roughly 6 centuries. The mind-body powers model applies Aquinas' thought in light of what we now know from modern neurobiology to the cellular level. According to the mind-body powers model, human persons have both mental powers of the mind and bodily powers of biological structures in the body that are interdependent partner powers. These interdependent mental and bodily powers are called mind-body powers. The power to feel what it's like to taste Swiss chocolate is a mental power. But this power relies on and is naturally co-manifested with bodily powers manifested by biological parts in the body that are suitably structured, from the macro level of the tongue to the micro level of neurons in the gustatory cortex. The power to experience what it's like to see the Matterhorn's north face is also a mental power, but it is not the same mental power as to feel what it's like to taste Swiss chocolate. Consequently, it co-manifests with a different set of bodily powers manifested by biological body parts which are sufficiently structured. From the organic level of the eyes to brain structures such as the optic chiasm to neurons in the visual cortex. Since the corresponding bodily powers are distinct, they are manifested by distinct biological body parts with particular structures sufficient to manifest the particular body powers. Thus, as different organs correspond to particular mental powers, which Aquinas recognized, different structures in the brain, even at the neuronal level, correspond to particular mental powers. This is because the mental powers rely on the manifestation of bodily powers in biological parts that are suitably structured. To provide perspicuity, let us illustrate the model with a simple diagram illustration using an example of a content-specific NCC. Consider the visual perception Swiss mountaineer Yvette Voucher has as she views the north face of the Matterhorn. Her mental power to consciously experience seeing the Matterhorn's north face, represented MPC, is manifested via the actual conscious experience of seeing the north face, represented CC. The mental power depends on corresponding bodily powers, represented BPC, manifested by neuronal activity, represented INSI. Let the double arrow on the bottom represent the metaphysical interdependence between the mental power and the bodily power, and the double arrow on the top represent the resulting natural correlation between the neural process and the conscious state. Then 2 vertical lines can represent the bodily and mental powers being manifested through the neural processes and the conscious state. On the bottom level, we have the mental and bodily powers represented that are the interdependent partner powers that constitute the mind-body power to visually perceive the Matterhorn's north face. On the top level, the conscious state manifesting the mental power and the NCC manifesting the bodily power are represented. Empirical neuroscience research studies what takes place on the top level, which is grounded in the metaphysics of the mind-body power on the bottom level. For the conscious state and its corresponding neural activity correlate with consistent regularity because they manifest a mental power and bodily power that are interdependent partner powers that naturally co-manifest as co-constituents of a mind-body power. Since the mental and bodily powers naturally co-manifest as co-constituents of a mind-body power, the manifestation of one indicates the manifestation of the other. And that is relevant to my research on empirically discerning the presence of consciousness in unresponsive patients, and you can feel free to ask me about that if you want in the Q&A. The mind-body powers model of NCC provides a good metaphysical explanation of neural correlates of consciousness, but it also has additional benefits. The hylomorphic human ontology informing it is consistent with the irreducibility of consciousness and the subject who is the bearer of consciousness. Yet at the same time, it's consistent with the intuition that our bodies are essential to human nature. These two benefits are especially important from the standpoint of Christian theology, since the view fits well with the doctrine of the intermediate state in which human persons exist disembodied, as well as the Christian's ultimate hope of bodily resurrection unto a state of everlasting blessedness in the presence of God forever. Furthermore, neo-Thomistic hylomorphism can circumnavigate dualism's annapurna with respect to mental causation, that is, the causal pairing problem, since the soul is united to the body as its form. It can also account for the synchronic and dichronic unity of the bearer of consciousness, as the ultimate bearer of consciousness is a metaphysically simple soul, not composed of parts, that persists through time as the body significantly changes through growth and aging. To boot, the mind-body powers model provides a metaphysical explanation for a principal foundation to neuroscience, or a principle that's foundational to neuroscience, namely that structure follows function. However, the model does not tell us what neural states and processes correlate with particular conscious states. Rather, the model leaves this to neuroscience research aimed at identifying what specific neuronal structures, states, and processes are sufficient to physically support particular conscious states. Yet, I will conclude by pointing out that the model provides motivation for such research, since the bodily powers, which are the interdependent partner powers of the mental powers manifested through states of consciousness, require sufficient physical properties in the body to be naturally manifested. Success in the search for NCC tells us what these physical properties are. Hence, we might say that the mind-body powers model of NCC informs the neurobiology of consciousness. Thus, not only is the existence of neural correlates compatible with various ontological views about consciousness and human nature, including dualism, there is also a dualist view that provides metaphysical motivation for the search for NCC. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Lassiter for comments before Q&A. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
It's the practice of the Socratic Club often to have a commentator respondent, and Dr. Charlie Lassiter from the Gonzaga Philosophy Department kindly agreed to respond.
Those you up here. Howdy. So thanks, David, for the invitation to come talk with y'all, and thanks, Matthew, for a really interesting and stimulating paper to think through. So I should say that I'm really sympathetic to the project here. A lot of my own work, I like to talk about mental powers, like Matthew does. Instead of focusing on neural correlates, I like to focus on social forces and cultural forces. But I think we're sort of talking we have similar concerns, right? Sort of similar approaches to problems. So what I want to do is just raise a couple of concerns I had when I was reading Matthew's paper and listening to him talk about it. So the first big concern I have is that the hylomorphic framework is disconnected from the powers ontology, right? So you've got the hylomorphism over here, and you've got the powers bit over here, but that they aren't sufficiently integrated. So you might wonder, why does that matter? Well, it matters because you could be a hylomorphist without having the powers ontology, in which case you have all the cool hylomorphism stuff, but you don't have the powers language to talk about the NCCs. Or you can have the powers language, but you can still be a thoroughgoing physicalist, right? So you don't have to have any kind of soul talk whatsoever. And you've still got powers and NCCs, right? So somebody like David Armstrong or Gilbert Ryle, right? These are folks who surely talk about powers and dispositions, but they would perhaps drop their teacups if you were to suggest that they weren't physicalists. So more broadly, we might ask ourselves, well, what is, so holomorphism, right, has these two bits, right? You've got the matter and the form. So I guess what I wonder is, what exactly on Matthew 2 does this have to do with powers, right? Like, what's the relationship between matter and form on the one hand and powers on the other, right? Because if we're going to have the kind of view that Matthew's suggesting here, then we're going to need something to connect these two pieces, right? We're going to need some kind of story there. So that's sort of the big overarching concern, right? We have these two big pieces that seem somewhat disconnected. A few other concerns that I have is that holomorphism seems to do a lot of cool work for things like mind-body problems, but I'm not quite sure what it can do for our understanding of the implications of the existence of the neural correlates of consciousness. Right, so, for example, Matthew mentioned briefly towards the end that the soul is united to the body as form. So I guess I just wonder, what does that do for us when we're understanding something about like the facial fusiform area? Because it just seems on the one hand, right, you might say, right, I'm just imagining a conversation with a cognitive neuroscientist saying something like, well, soul is united to body as a form, and the cognitive neuroscientist saying, cool. So finally, one more sort of concern I have, and this just might be a bit idiosyncratic to me, but what the heck, is this final picture we've got here, right? So on this view, we have interdependent partner powers, right, with the bodily powers and the mental powers. So what I worry is that this isn't expansive enough, right? That we don't have enough powers here to describe or to adequately account for the phenomena we're interested in. Right? So for example, consider the Muller-Lyer illusion. Right? Folks who have taken sort of Psych 101, or perhaps have seen this, right, where you have the two parallel lines, and they're the same length, but on one line, the tips of the arrows flare in, and on the bottom line, they flare out, right? So the lengths of the middle segments are the same, but the heads on the arrows shoot in different directions. Now, if you present the lines to somebody who grows up in Spokane or really anywhere in the US, any place where you have these kinds of carpentered corners, then folks will say that one line appears longer than the other. Right? However, if you present the same image to somebody who didn't grow up in a building with carpentered corners, they'll say that the lines appear the same, right? That they do not appear different. So, Westerners, folks who grow up in buildings like this, are subject to the Muller-Lyer illusion, whereas folks who grow up in places that aren't like this, right? So you might think, folks growing up in sub-Saharan Africa, or folks growing up in the Brazilian rainforest, they are not subject to the illusion. So, what I want to suggest then is that cultural forces, environmental forces, and social forces too, are important in our conscious experience. We experience things the way we do, in part because of our social and cultural contexts and histories. Now, I mention that because you don't find that here, right? Our interdependent partner powers are restricted to our bodily powers and our mental powers, but I want to suggest that we need to broaden that picture to include social powers and cultural powers, and also social, cultural, environmental powers as well. So that's what I got. Thanks again for a wonderful talk.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Lassiter, for the comments. I think I will start with the third point. And I'll gladly admit that this is not a comprehensive, model of all of what impacts human nature, has an influence on our mental functioning. This is a model, as its name suggests, that is focused on accounting for neural correlates of consciousness and why there are these consistent correspondence relations between our conscious states, specific conscious states, and neural activity in the brain that is structured in a particular way, or that acts in a particular way, or has a certain type of constitution. So it by no means is meant to explain any more than that, other than it just explains the NCCs, the neural correlates of consciousness, which is why it's called the mind-body powers model of NCCs. And then I think I'll jump back to the first point that Dr. Lassiter made. And if I understood you correctly, there's a disconnect between a powers ontology and Aristotelian Thomistic hylomorphism. And you could have one without the other. You could have hylomorphism without mind-body powers, or causal powers in general, or causal powers without hylomorphism. And where's the connection is kind of the issue. Is that right? So I agree with you 100% that you can have causal powers without hylomorphism. Or you could have hylomorphism without causal powers. But much of my work has focused on relying on Aristotle's understanding of causation and Thomas Aquinas' view of human nature, and then bringing their insights to bear on issues of contemporary neurobiology that are focused on human consciousness. And Thomas Aquinas not only followed Aristotle in his thinking about hylomorphism, but he also bought into much of Aristotle's metaphysics as well. And so you see him using the idea of causal powers and capacities and so forth. And so I'm just kind of being consistent with Thomas Aquinas there. Now, that brings me to your second point, which I think is kind of related to a sub-point that you made in discussing the first point. And that is that, hylomorphism might be able to do a lot of interesting stuff for us with regards to the mind-body problem. But you don't see how that's helpful necessarily to the cognitive neuroscientist per se. So you seem to be agreeing with me, though, that when it comes to causal powers, there is a lot that we can offer to cognitive neuroscientists, right? But that work is not being really done by hylomorphism, per se, if I've understood you correctly. And I agree with you there. I think that most of the work being done for neurobiology in my model is being done by the causal powers ontology, or the metaphysics of causation from an Aristotelian perspective. But I don't think that that's the only data that we should be trying to account for and explain. So I think that there's also a full, more robust ontology of human persons and understanding of human consciousness is also going to need to explain further interesting data, and that's the philosophical data about ourselves, such as the unity of consciousness, the irreducibility of consciousness, the fact that the bearer of consciousness can persist through time and change of the size of their body and many different, the cells within their body, and a lot of different physical properties that are true of their body at one time, but not true of their body at another time. And also, I think that we need to give a coherent account of mental causation as well. And so I think that physicalism is just explanatorily inadequate to account for many of these points of philosophical data about ourselves. And I think that physicalism also, as Jaegwon Kim so helpfully pointed out, in Mind in a Physical World and in Physicalism or Something Near Enough, pointed out that physicalism itself faces significant issues with regards to mental causation. But I don't think hylomorphism actually has a fatal flaw with regards, or fatal problem with regards to mental causation. I think that the chief problem that the dualist faces is the problem of causal pairing. And essentially that problem says, how could my non-physical soul be causally paired with my physical body? The only relation that could pair it would be a spatial relation. And my soul, if it's non-physical, can't stand in a spatial relation to my body because it just can't stand in spatial relations given that it's non-physical. And so there is no, says Kim, relation that can pair my non-physical soul as a mental cause of physical effects in my body. But on hylomorphism, there's a more fundamental relation, and that is the informing relation. And that can also do work in the philosophy of mind with regards to the mind-body problem in general, and persistence through time and change, and these sorts of issues. And also I think that hylomorphism in general just has a lot going for it from a metaphysical standpoint too. So that would be some thoughts, at least in the first attempt of thinking through what you had to say about the model. And so once again, thank you very much for your thoughts. Yeah. And shall I open it up to Q&A now?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
What you've done is you've given the chassis on which to build an understanding of how we as human beings, as human ontology reacts to the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I got tremendously excited with what Aquinas is doing in equation, because that other stuff, from a purely materialist point of view, there's no grade there in terms of how to and to the gentleman's point, being Chinese, remember China or Chinese community, piece of culture, like let's say that's my ontology right there. I'm responding to things in Chinese culture. I grew up in the States, so when in American culture, I'm responding to things the way American culture respond. The chassis is the same. So I appreciate this model. You had mentioned Calvin, and reference to how Catholicism. One thing I appreciate about Catholic theology is that it gives us the tools to comprehend these issues. How do you see the Reformation theology from the Protestant end of things? Is there anything perhaps just like a modeling for what it is you have to do?
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you very much for your previous comments too. My reference there was just with respect to their thinking about human ontology and the idea that we're not merely the body. So, for example, the Heidelberg Catechism, I think the very first question of the Catechism is, where is my only comfort in life and in death? And the response, the answer is that I belong, body and soul, to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so it seems to be suggesting a dualist human ontology and not just a mere materialist human ontology. And then also the Catechism talks about the intermediate state as well.
It says all those things, but doesn't provide us tools to build the chassis.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. And so I would say that, really, in my opinion, Thomas Aquinas has done the greatest amount of philosophical reflection about human nature compared to anyone else in the history of Christian thought, which is why I've really appreciated his work. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you pitch Aquinas as a dualist, though, right? I mean, isn't it? I mean, it's not necessarily settled that he's a dualist in the way that there's, the soul as a separate substance, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're describing Aquinas as sort of a substance dualist, right?
Yep.
I mean, but it's arguable that he's not a substance dualist.
Yeah. I appreciate that question. And I've presented on this material a lot, and this is my second time presenting on it here on this campus. And so I appreciate, this is why I love to, have an audience that is as informed about the Catholic tradition as an audience here at Gonzaga, because I get these sort of questions about how should we most accurately and faithfully interpret Thomas Aquinas. So I thought I might get that question. There are, several quotes that I think are relevant from Aquinas. There is this one from Disputed Questions About Spiritual Creatures. And he says, it must be said that the soul has subsistent actual being, inasmuch as its own actual being does not depend on the body, seeing that it is something raised above corporeal matter. So it's clearly not identical to that corporeal matter. And yet it receives the body into a share in this actual being in such a way that there is one actual being of soul and body, which is the actual being of form. So the soul has its own actual being, and then it shares that actual being with the body. And there's another statement like that in the Summa Theologica, in question 76, article 1, ad 5 in the Prima Pars. Aquinas writes, the soul shares with corporeal matter the existence in which it subsists. From that matter and from the intellective soul, one thing comes about. This occurs in such a way that the existence that belongs to the whole composite also belongs to the soul itself, something that does not occur in the case of other forms, which are not subsistent. Now, someone might want to say, well, okay, yeah, Aquinas says that the soul is a subsistence, but not that it is a substance. Now, so Eleanor Stump has written, maybe we should invent a new genus, subsistence dualism, under which substance dualism will be one species and Aquinas' account of the soul another. But perhaps we need not be so fussy. It is clear that Aquinas' account of the soul is more nearly allied with substance dualism than with property dualism. And if we do not take substance in substance dualism too strictly, if it can include subsistent things that are not complete substances, then we can count Aquinas among the substance dualists. In that case, we ought to categorize Aquinas as a non-Cartesian substance dualist and put him in the camp of those opposed to physicalism. And now, I agree that, for one, the categories are a little bit messy in general, which is why I spent that time clarifying how I see the categories at the beginning. But I think that there's also, in a milieu where it's dominated by materialism and physicalism, it's tempting as, an Aquinas advocate to want to say, oh, no, Aquinas is not a dualist, definitely not a substance dualist. And to want to, label him or categorize him in the camp that enjoys the most favorable opinion, you know. But I mean, really though, I think that that's being disingenuous, because when you think about Aquinas, I'm not saying that you're trying to be disingenuous, or that other Thomistic scholars that have asked me questions about this have been trying to be disingenuous, but I just don't, I mean, I wouldn't mind, you know, categorizing him in a different category. But I just think that it's disingenuous, because when you think about what he thought about the nature of the soul, he thought that, you know, that the body is required for intellectual cognition, for the soul to naturally cognize. But he thought that it could also cognize independently of the body in an alternative but metaphysically possible mode of operation in the intermediate state. And for that reason, he thought that it continued to exist in the intermediate state, disembodied. And so any materialist or physicalist or just philosopher of mind that is not concerned about, oh, you know, how are we going to label Aquinas so that he's viewed most favorably, they're just going to say, yeah, that is clearly a substance dualist view. I don't care if Aquinas called it a subsistent soul. That's what we mean by substance dualism, or like that view clearly falls within the camp of substance dualism, given the categories that I am working with that I laid out at the beginning. Now, granted, on Aquinas' view, there is a human person that is one material substance. So you don't have the body being a standalone, self-existing substance, and then the soul being another standalone, self-existing substance. But I even doubt that Descartes actually believed that about the body as well. But nevertheless, you know, there is one substance, but still that substance has its existence that is rooted in the soul, and the soul has its own existence, and the soul can exist disembodied. So it seems to me that it can't escape being called a substance dualist position. And so I resonate with Edward Fieser's quote here. In their zeal to emphasize the difference between Aquinas' position and that of Plato or Descartes, some of his defenders have tended to insist that he was not only not a materialist, but not a dualist either. But this pox on both houses approach, motivated in part, perhaps by a fear that contemporary philosophers might be too quick to dismiss Aquinas if he is labeled with the D word, is not very plausible. And then he goes on and he says, you know, we should just defend Aquinas' position on its merits rather than pretend it's something it is not. And I mean, personally, I went into philosophy not to go into fashion. And so I don't really care what the view is called. If I think that it's true, and if it's an unpopular position, then I'll defend it. Even if that means that I'm labeled with the dirty D word. It doesn't bother me one iota. And so, yeah.
So thank you for your paper, and thank you, Dr. Lester, also for your comments. I had a question actually for both of you, but the two questions are related. So, Dr. Owen, when you're describing active and passive powers, initially introducing them as partner powers, you use the example of the sun heating the body of water, the passive power being the ability to be heated, and the active power being the ability to heat. That doesn't seem to line up exactly with your BP and MP here, which you describe them as partner powers. It would seem as though the partner powers are the active and the passive, in which case you have the active power of seeing in virtue of both the organ of the eye and the organ of the brain, and the power of the soul to apprehend, and the passive power being something being colored, right? That something can be seen would be the passive power, and the active power is the power of sight, which involves this interior complex. So my question for you is, on the one hand, it seems like there's been a shift in your vocabulary, some sort of equivocation there on the part of powers, because BP and MP also presume a seeable quality in an object that is seen. And likewise, seeing as how we're talking about both animals here and human beings, and you also spoke about intellectual powers that can function without a bodily organ. It seems like BP and MP might describe what we see in a dog's apprehension.
Yeah.
But then with a human being, we also have to have the question of this intellectual power that transcends, as Aquinas is going to argue, that transcends the function of the organ of the eye and the organ of the brain. So, in Aquinas' languages, I maybe have the interior senses here, but there's still a human function. So I'm wondering, when the neuroscientists do these experiments, don't they need to distinguish between the results of the brain studies that show, for example, things that both dogs and humans can do, see a tree, versus things that only human beings do, say perform mathematical problems? I mean, do they pay attention to the differences of those activities when they're doing these studies? And then I'll give you a chance to picture both, because I want to point out how this connects to what Dr. Lasker said, which is you posed an objection to the complex of hylomorphism on one hand and body power, powers on the other. And I don't find myself quite able to follow you why those necessarily or so easily can be separated, because my question would be, how would you know you have a substantial form in some substance, right? Hylomorphism, the form and the matter. How would you know you have that form unless you have some sort of activity that speak to the existence of powers? Namely, those powers are not something that float around through space, but they're inherent necessarily in form. In fact, we know certain forms only because of the complex of powers, right? It's these essential powers that we call that kind of a form versus some other kind of form. So, and that would take us back around to this question about the partner powers. Like, we know there's a form because there are powers. We know the powers because we have passive things being activated by active powers.
Go ahead.
So I guess my concern is that like a bare bones hylomorphism would just say you got matter, you got fluid. Right? So you take something like my empty coffee cup here, and it's a bit of matter that's structured in a particular sort of way. It's matter that's structured in a particular sort of way. And so when we ask, and so you have this substance, right? So the substance is the composite of the matter and the form. But at that point, I'm not necessarily committed to there being powers, right? I'm committed to there being substance, and maybe there are properties, right? Properties that adhere in this substance. So you might have a substance property ontology, but a substance property ontology isn't necessarily a substance power ontology, right? You can have properties that aren't powers. So that would be a hylomorphism without the powers. Right, where you have substances composed of matter and form, and then you have properties inherent in the substance. Right. So I guess I just want to say that that's a live possibility on the view Matthew was describing, and I just wanted a little bit more motivation for connecting the hylomorphism to the powers ontology.
If I could ask you a follow-up question, isn't it significant for your response that you refer to an artificial object, right? So the powers that are associated with substantial forms, the cup is not a substantial form, the cup is accidental form, right? the substantial form there would be, say, in the cellulose, right, a wood product that wood has certain inherent powers and properties, combustibility, for example. So I'm wondering, I mean, would you say the same thing for natural forms as opposed to accidental
I use
forms?
this cup only because I can, hold it and gesture to it. But no, I mean, right? Human beings are composed of, bits of stuff organized in certain ways. And so you might say that a human being is a composite of matter and form. But that doesn't commit you to saying that they have certain powers in virtue of that form, right? So, right, because the bare bones hydromorphism just says that there's, matter and form, right? That's all you need to get a hydromorphous view off the ground. But that says nothing about, what kinds of powers or properties adhere to the substance.
I guess I'll have to think about it more. It's just not clear to me what form would be there. I mean, if we talk about, we talk easily about matter. What's matter? I guess my question there is what's
the
form?
point that you're thinking form is always form for functionality. That's what you're thinking.
Form is
So the form
is
of a
a
human
kind of
person.
nature, right? I mean,
Sorry?
so Aristotle and Aquinas' chain is actions flow from powers, powers flow from natures, right? And natures are the result of form, right? But I mean, they're not separable things. Something has a particular nature because it has a particular form. It's another shorthand way of saying it. So if something has a form, it has a nature, it's out of that nature, like natures are discrete. They're this thing rather than that thing. And they're this thing rather than that thing because they manifest certain powers in activity, right?
Or that's how we know it.
Right, exactly. So that's why I'm having difficulty seeing that powers can be separated from form if form is meant to, if the word form is meant to point to the identity of something, which is also its nature.
I think that one helpful, first of all, that's a great question, and same with your previous question. Thank you very much, and for your overall comments. But I think that it might be important to distinguish between, the epistemic work that powers are doing in your description, because that's how we come to know that, it's this type of form that informs this type of entity because it can develop in such a way that it can perform these sorts of actions. And so we come to know that it has that type of form. But I don't think that necessarily entails that there can't be causal powers, though, that are not grounded in a substantial form. The cup could have causal powers, and yet the cup itself has an accidental form or an artifact form, right? So you could have causal powers without a substantial form. But the cup can't do what I can do. And so once you see what I can do and what the cup can't do, then the question arises, well, why can this material object do what it can do, but not what that cup can do, and vice versa? And then that would get us into a discussion of the different types of forms with different natures, with different capacities.
Yeah, I think that would address it, except so you use the example of the cup as something that has powers without having a substantial form. But my question is, the powers that the cup has as an artifact, right, something with an accidental form, the powers that the cup has depend upon the powers that its natural materials have. And so, therefore, the powers of the cup are derivative from the powers of the natural forms involved. Right? You wouldn't try to make, or it'd be short-lived business venture to make coffee cups out of ice, right? You pour the coffee in and the cup dissolves. So the reason this cup has its accidental form is dependent upon the natural properties of its materials. That is, the powers of the cup depend upon the powers of its materials.
Yeah.
If you want to call them powers of the cup.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying there, and I'm not sure that I know necessarily what to think about it per se.
What was the question?
Yeah.
We're a little over time, so I'm going to call halt. But the conversation continues. It always does. I forgot to mention, actually, I wanted to especially thank Dr. Lassiter. He's on sabbatical, by the way. He came and provided comments, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.